everyone, and welcome to this inclusive and usable design for open source short lightning talk. So these are investigations into design usability, user interfaces, and user experience via my past role at superbloom.design. Three projects will be talked about: the user project, the Turing Institute, and Strudel and the Carpentries lesson, the last two being very briefly mentioned. A little bit about me. I'm a designer. I've worked for over 15 years as a designer, and I've worked on open source software technology projects, both in-house and on a project-to-project basis over the last 8 years. So the user, which stands for Usable Software Ecosystem Research Project, researched how usability and design presents in scientific open source software, with the goal of investigating what the conditions are that enable scientific open source teams to prioritize and focus on usability successfully. It's supported by the Sloan Foundation, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some key insights, 3 key insights from this project. So the first being when to do design. From the research, the short answer was when we get funding to hire design experts is when scientific open source accesses design experts. And this is described as designers that can self-manage and conduct the work kind of like a paid freelancer is expected to do. So not described as like open source software design contributions, which were in the study perceived rather poorly, like ad hoc, amateurish, flighty, random, and unstructured, as opposed to a paid freelancer, which does we found speak more to the lack of clear product discussion direction from the open source software projects themselves. A design freelancer has more time and attention and ability while being paid to clarify what the goals are, and actually needs to clarify the goals as far as like their delivery goes, whereas open source contributions don't often get the ability to clarify those kinds of things. When I was reading a paper which is called Framework for Governance in Open Source Communities by Christoph Lattemann and Stefan Stieglitz from Potsdam University, I personally began to think of these optimal phases that open source typically has, as described in the paper, where and when the attitudes of design and designers would be most welcome in the phases of open source. In the early phases of most open source, there are these high levels of developer or creator energy to scratch their own itches and develop according to specific personal problems or needs. Design tends to bring in a wider user-centered energy and a questioning that doesn't really meld well with that initial energy of most open source, until the open source has gained some of this outward-facing energy where they can begin to think about the needs of new users other than the creators themselves, is when I think design can be done in any open source, inclusive of scientific open source software. What design is valued: minimalism and complexity and the perception of good design. So traditional design prioritizes minimalism and frictionless experiences for users, and often trends in design. So like glass morphism is a good example from the new Apple UI interface. But minimalism is rooted in historic design tastes, which is a tool from the elite classes, and has colonial anti-craft as in traditional indigenous crafts flavor. And it has grounding in making tasks easy, simple, and clear. So the history and application can be complicated. But open source software from a hacker culture perspective, from what my research, and often deprioritizes the visual form over function and things that you can do, computations, filtering, whatever you can do in the open source. And it's targeted towards power users, so people that could be described as experts in either their technology, coding, or scientific field. And these kinds of users will tend to choose options and functions over simplicity. Simplicity or minimalism here can also be seen as anti-intellectual or anti-complexity function. So open source software is often afraid that design will minimalize the complexity to such an extent that it will no longer be considered expert level technology, which with that comes the trappings of that new or novice users can be viewed as burdensome to the open source software creators and the people that make that open source software, as well as it just not being able to be used by anybody except for these power user experts. Lastly, designer perspectives and challenges in open source. So designers are actively discouraged from certain activities and processes that are common in open source that are common in the commercial and proprietary space in favor of aligning with how open source software works mostly. So designers are discouraged from using time and budget to gain data insights and talk to users. And often those things aren't defined and set out in grant funding if the open source is funded by grants. So there's some quotes from designers here saying one designer had to lobby if they wanted people to do the design work that they're not already working on. And a little bit further down, you can see that they spoke about how tasks that developers can do and find urgent are done quickly. Itches they can scratch will be scratched, and it is difficult to convince others to prioritize design. So because the developers can do the scratching of their own itches, but they won't and can't allow design to do the same thing infrastructurally within open source projects right now, designers are often halted from participating in a similar way that coders are in open source. To speak really briefly about some of these last projects as I'm over time, we worked with the Alan Turing Institute on how they build out capacity for product management and design strategy through some resources and templates like audience and stakeholder mapping, contributor and user journey maps, and heuristic analysis as a proxy for designers, which you can find resources linked on this slide. And then here we go into a little bit of detail about how we worked with a Strudel, which is a UI kit for scientific software. And a common problem that is similar with generative AI, as is with design kits, where you can use these design kits and their opinionated versions of like what the optimal design UI might be. But what these UI design kits won't teach you is why that design is good, usable, relevant for the particular users. So what we did with the carpentries is we started to build a curriculum, a series of lessons that helped scientific and researchers of open source software better understand why certain designs are better than other designs, or why you might want to choose a UI component over one other UI component. And with that, I'll say thank you. Again, if you want to find out more about these projects, you need to contact superbloom.design because they own these projects. These are the projects that I worked on with them. But thank you for listening.